Okay, not bad at all. Okay, for your Kin 225 class today, I've got a brief review on the force-velocity relationship. And then the main topic for today is muscle contraction, specifically propagation of an action potential. So an action potential is like an electrical charge that will travel down your motor neuron axon to the muscle fiber membrane and then down the T-tubule to your sarcoplasmic reticulum where you have release of calcium. So that's the main topic for today, the propagation of the action potential, how the charge across the membrane changes, the ions that come in, the ions that go out. That's what we'll be discussing. But first, I'm going to talk about the force-velocity relationship again, and I'm covering this because this is the topic of your lab number 2, which is next week. So, question here. What exercise would be best for training muscular power in the legs? So we have performing squats with very heavy weights, performing unloaded vertical jumps, or performing vertical jumps while holding light to moderate weights. And what you have to think about here is you have to think about the force-velocity relationship, and where power is optimal. So last class, we mentioned that, the high force output is around the point where you have zero velocity. This is called your isometric strength. It's like contracting a muscle where the muscle is not changing in length. Your force output is quite high there, but the velocity is zero. And then out on this extreme, you have a very high velocity, but you can see the force output is very low. And the force output is low at high velocities because actin and myosin cross bridges are sliding past each other very fast, and they can't form strong cross bridges when they're moving very fast. So your power output, recall from last day, your power is equal to force multiplied by velocity. So out here you have high force, but close to zero velocity. So, when you multiply force by velocity, is whatever the force is, it's going to be multiplied by zero, and your power is going to be zero. And same thing out here, as force multiplied by velocity. Your velocity is high, but your force is very low. You can see it's approaching zero. So again, your force multiplied by velocity, your power output is going to be very low out here. So you have to think about where on this force velocity curve you would fall for each of these variations of the squats or vertical jumps. So performing squats with very heavy weights, you're generating a lot of force, but you're not moving at a very fast velocity when you're moving heavy weights on the squat exercise. So you'd be out on this part of the force velocity curve, very high force output, but low velocity. Performing unloaded vertical jumps, you're probably moving at a very high velocity, but your force output isn't going to be that high. Whereas performing vertical jumps while holding light to moderate weights, you can probably move at a moderate velocity and you're generating a moderate amount of force because you're holding a light to moderate amount of weight. And so this part of force velocity curve is where you would have the optimal power output. It's where your force multiplied by velocity would give you the greatest power. So the best answer, I think, to this question would be C, performing vertical jumps while holding light to moderate weights. And one thing I should mention about this force velocity curve is, and this applies to one of the questions on your lab, I mentioned that this point where you have zero velocity and very high force is called isometric contraction. So isometric because your muscle's not changing length. And then this part of the curve where the force is gradually decreasing with velocity, that is called a concentric contraction. So your muscle is shortening while you're lifting a load. So that's called a concentric contraction. So your muscle is shortening while it's generating force. And you can see concentrically, as you increase the velocity, your force output would decrease. One other question I have on the labs is about, it's a rugby specific question, and it's about forwards versus backs. And so this is just to clarify how forwards versus backs look. This bigger guy here, it's a little bit stouter, probably stronger. That's your typical forward in rugby. And then your typical back, this is probably a larger than usual back, but your typical back is a smaller, leaner, faster type of player. So you have to think about, there's a question pertaining to force and velocity that's specific to rugby in your lab number 2. And it asks about difference between forwards versus backs. You just have to think about the difference between these two players with regards to their ability to generate high force output versus their ability to generate high velocities.